He leaned close enough that I could smell his cologne and whispered, "We won." His voice was calm, almost bored, like the outcome had been decided long before we stepped into that courtroom. The woman beside him let out a soft laugh, the kind that barely made a sound but said everything. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. Her hand rested on his arm with practiced ease, her smile steady, satisfied. They shared a glance that lasted a second too long, the kind of look people exchange when they believe no one else in the room matters. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. Silence was the only thing I had brought with me that morning, and I intended to use it. The judge opened the file. Paper shifted. Pages turned. The sound echoed through the room louder than any argument. The judge didn't speak. She read in complete silence, her expression unreadable, her posture unchanged. Seconds stretched. Then more seconds. The room grew still in a way that felt heavy, unnatural, like everyone was holding their breath without realizing it. They mistook that silence for formality. I knew better. I stood there alone at my table, my hands folded neatly in front of me, feeling the weight of every assumption stacked against me. 3 of them on one side, me on the other. They looked relaxed, settled, already moving on in their minds. I could feel their confidence radiating across the room, warm and careless. What they didn't know was that I had stopped coming to court hoping to be understood. I had come prepared to be underestimated. The courtroom itself was unremarkable. Pale walls, hard benches, a seal mounted behind the judge that had seen thousands of stories pass through without sentiment. Justice didn't care how convincing someone sounded or how confidently they smiled. It only cared about what could be proven and what could no longer be ignored. The judge's eyes moved steadily across the page. No nodding, no frowning, just reading. Behind me I could sense movement, a subtle shift, someone crossing their legs, someone settling back, comfortable. They thought the hardest part was over. They thought this was the quiet moment before everything ended in their favor. I focused on my breathing, in through my nose, out through my mouth, slow, controlled. I had promised myself I wouldn't let my body betray what my face refused to show. This wasn't the first time they had assumed I would crumble quietly. It was just the first time they had done it in front of a judge. I had learned over months of careful observation how easily people dismiss a woman who doesn't raise her voice, how quickly calm is confused with weakness, how often silence is interpreted as surrender. They believed that because I wasn't arguing, I wasn't fighting. Because I wasn't crying, I had nothing left. The truth was simpler. I had already done my fighting. The judge paused. Not a dramatic pause. Not the kind that signals a speech is coming. Just a moment where her hand stopped moving and the page remained half-turned. She looked down, then back at the file, as if something required a second look. I felt it then. That subtle shift in the air. The kind you don't see but feel in your chest. Something had caught her attention. He didn't notice. He was still leaning back in his chair, his confidence intact, his mouth tilted upward in the faintest smile. The woman beside him adjusted her posture, smoothing her skirt, already preparing for what she thought would be the end of this inconvenience. I didn't look at them. I watched the judge. When she finally lifted her eyes, she didn't look at him first. She didn't look at the woman. Her gaze found me instead, steady and assessing, as if she were seeing me clearly for the first time. I met her eyes without blinking. That moment pulled me back, just briefly, to another time. A time when standing beside him felt safe. When I believed that sharing a life meant sharing decisions. When I thought being included was permanent, not conditional. I had walked into this marriage believing loyalty was mutual and respect was assumed. That belief hadn't shattered all at once. It cracked slowly, quietly, in moments that were easy to dismiss until they weren't. By the time I understood what was happening, I had already been pushed to the margins of my own life, watching decisions being made about me without me. This hearing wasn't about heartbreak. It was about erasure. The judge closed the file gently. The sound was soft, controlled, final in a way that made my stomach tighten. She removed her glasses and set them on the bench, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Still, no words. I heard him shift beside me. Just slightly, a breath taken, a posture adjusted. He was waiting for the formalities to conclude, for the predictable language that would confirm what he already believed. I knew something he didn't. Silence, I had learned, can be a weapon, especially when the truth is sitting right in front of someone with the authority to speak it aloud. The judge drew a breath. And in that moment, before she said a single word, I understood that everything they thought they had secured was already slipping through their fingers. There was a time when I never imagined standing alone in a courtroom, measured and weighed by strangers, while the man I loved sat across from me as if we were adversaries. When I close my eyes, I can still remember how certain I once felt that I belonged at his side, not opposite him. We didn't meet in a dramatic way. There was no music, no champagne, no instant spark that people like to romanticize. We met because of responsibility, a mutual obligation, a problem that needed solving. He impressed everyone in the room with how calmly he handled pressure, how steady his voice was when others panicked. I noticed him because he didn't rush to speak. He listened first. That felt rare, safe. Back then, I had my own life fully intact. My work mattered to me. My independence wasn't something I planned to give up for anyone. He seemed to respect that. He admired it even. He told me more than once that he liked how I didn't need to be taken care of. I believed him. When we started seeing each other, it felt balanced. Conversations went both ways. Decisions were discussed, not announced. He asked what I thought. He remembered my answers. I mistook that attentiveness for something permanent. Meeting his family came sooner than I expected. They were close, the kind of close that prides itself on tradition and loyalty. Dinners were formal without being stiff. Smiles came easily, questions were polite, curious. I was introduced as someone important, someone who mattered to him. His mother hugged me and said I seemed grounded. His father nodded approvingly when I spoke. I remember driving home that night feeling relieved, convinced I had passed some unspoken test. In those early months, I felt included. Family plans were shared openly. Conversations happened around me, not away from me. When opinions were asked, mine was heard. I noticed even then that final decisions tended to circle back to him, or to one particular family elder. But I told myself that was normal. Every family had its rhythm. I assumed I would find my place in it over time. The first changes were small enough to excuse. Adjusting schedules, rearranging priorities. I found myself bending more often than I realized. I stopped questioning things that made me uncomfortable because I didn't want to seem difficult. When he thanked me for being understanding, I felt proud of that flexibility. I thought compromise was a sign of love. There were moments, though, that lingered strangely in my memory. A comment from a relative about how nothing ever stays the same forever. A joke that landed a little too close to something unspoken. Once, during a family dinner, a decision about the future was discussed casually, and I realized afterward no one had actually asked me what I wanted. When I brought it up later, he smiled and said we'd talk about it another time. I believed him. I wanted harmony. I wanted to be seen as someone who fit, not someone who challenged the order of things. So I learned when to stay quiet. I learned when to let things go. At the time, it felt like maturity. It felt like choosing peace. Looking back now, I can see how easily acceptance was confused with approval, how warmth can exist alongside quiet conditions. I didn't understand then that being welcomed didn't mean being protected. It just meant I was useful in the way they needed me to be. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in glances exchanged before responding to me, in conversations that slowed when I entered the room, in decisions that were already framed before I was informed. Each time, I told myself I was imagining it, that strong families were efficient, that not everything required my input. He never dismissed me outright in those early days. That's what made it harder to question. He reassured without explaining, smiled without changing anything. When I expressed discomfort, he told me I was overthinking. He said I was sensitive because I cared deeply. I wore that like a badge of honor. There was one moment I replay often now. We were leaving a family gathering, and someone made a comment about how things work best when everyone knows their role. It was said lightly with a laugh. I laughed too. I didn't realize until much later that I had just been placed somewhere without my consent. I truly believed that if I gave enough patience, enough understanding, everything would settle. I thought belonging was something you earned through effort and goodwill. I didn't yet understand that in that family, belonging could be revoked quietly, without announcement. By the end of that year, I felt something shift inside me, though I didn't have the language for it yet. A faint sense that my place wasn't as solid as I thought, that my presence was appreciated, but not essential. I told myself it would pass, that once we were fully established, once life slowed down, things would feel balanced again. I held on to that belief longer than I should have. What I didn't know then was that the moment I stopped being convenient was the moment I became a problem. The first time I felt unnecessary, nothing dramatic happened. No argument, no raised voices, no obvious betrayal. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that should have passed without leaving a mark, except it didn't. He told me about a decision over breakfast. Not asked, told. His tone was calm, almost gentle, as if the matter had already been handled and all that remained was to inform me. I remember nodding automatically, the way you do when you're still processing words that arrive too quickly. By the time I realized I had an opinion, the conversation had already moved on. I didn't say anything then. I told myself it was efficient, that he was just being decisive, that not every choice needed to be a discussion. Strong marriages, I believed, didn't waste energy on unnecessary debates. Still, something lodged itself in my chest that morning. A small, sharp awareness that I hadn't been consulted because my input hadn't been required. After that, I began to notice a pattern. He spoke in conclusions instead of possibilities. Plans were presented as facts. Timelines were outlined without pause, as if the space where my thoughts used to fit had quietly closed. When I tried to circle back, to ask questions, he reassured me with a smile and said everything was under control. It was always framed as consideration. Less stress for me. One less thing to worry about. He said it often enough that I started repeating it to myself. Family gatherings changed too, though it took me a while to admit it. I found myself listening more than speaking. When I did offer an opinion, it was acknowledged politely, then gently overridden. Conversations flowed around me instead of through me. No one argued with me anymore. No one challenged what I said. At first, I thought that meant I had finally earned acceptance. Later, I understood it meant I had stopped being relevant. There was a new name I heard more often than I liked. It came up casually, woven into conversations without explanation. He mentioned her perspective in passing, how practical she was, how she understood certain situations better than most people. I had never met her. I didn't even know what she looked like. But her influence was already present, faint but persistent, like background noise you can't tune out once you notice it. When I asked who she was, he brushed it off easily. Someone he worked with, someone the family trusted. Nothing for me to worry about. The reassurance came quickly, too quickly, and that should have told me something. I told myself I was being insecure. I reminded myself that not every woman with a name was a threat, that healthy relationships didn't crumble under imagined competition. I wanted to believe that. The first time he contradicted me in front of others, it happened so smoothly I almost missed it. We were discussing something minor, something that affected both of us, and I shared my thoughts the way I always had. He smiled, corrected me, and continued speaking as if I hadn't been there. No one reacted. No one looked uncomfortable. I felt my face warm, embarrassment creeping up my neck, but I swallowed it. I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene, that it was a misunderstanding, that I could talk to him later. later never came. Instead, there were more moments like that. Small dismissals, gentle interruptions, a growing sense that my role was to agree, not to contribute. When I tried to articulate how it made me feel, he sighed and said I was reading too much into things. He said stress made people sensitive. He said I needed to trust him. I wanted to. I really did. I began rationalizing my silence. I told myself endurance was strength, that patience was maturity, that love meant adapting, not insisting. It didn't occur to me then that I was confusing survival with loyalty. The moment that finally pierced through my denial was painfully simple. I learned about a change that directly affected my life from someone else. Not from him, not from a conversation. Just an offhand comment that assumed I already knew. My stomach dropped as the words settled in. I waited until we were alone to ask about it. I kept my voice steady. Casual. He looked surprised, then annoyed, as if my question was an inconvenience. He said he hadn't thought it was necessary to involve me yet. That everything was still fluid. But it wasn't fluid. It was already in motion. That night, lying awake beside him, I stared at the ceiling and felt something unfamiliar settle over me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was the quiet realization that I was being moved around without being moved with. I thought back over the past months, replaying moments I had dismissed, the polite smiles, the reassurance without substance, the way decisions seemed to glide past me now, smooth and final. I saw how often my discomfort had been met with calm dismissal instead of curiosity. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that this wasn't accidental, that my exclusion wasn't a misunderstanding, that someone else was being consulted in my place, and it wasn't because I had failed. That realization didn't make things easier, it made them heavier. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't cry. I didn't demand explanations. I lay there in the dark, listening to his breathing, and understood something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't being pushed out loudly. I was being replaced quietly. And the worst part was that everyone else seemed to know it before I did. Her name started appearing in conversations the way a scent lingers in a room long after someone has left. Subtle at first, easy to ignore, then impossible not to notice. He mentioned her casually, usually when discussing plans or decisions that no longer seemed to require my input. He spoke about her perspective with a kind of respect I hadn't heard in his voice toward me in a while. Practical, clear-headed, someone who understood how things worked. Each time her name came up, it felt like a small reminder that someone else's opinions were being weighed alongside his, while mine were quietly set aside. What struck me most was that no one ever properly introduced her. Not once did someone say, "This is who she is, this is why she matters." It was as if that moment was being intentionally postponed, as though giving her a formal place in my world would make the imbalance too obvious too soon. His family spoke about her with a familiarity that unsettled me. They referenced conversations I hadn't been part of, opinions she had already shared, insights she had apparently offered with ease. When I asked questions, I was met with smiles that felt rehearsed. "Don't worry, she's just helpful. You're reading too much into it." Reassurance always arrived after the discomfort had already settled in. The first time I saw her in person, it wasn't an introduction. It was a passing moment, the kind that leaves you no room to orient yourself. We were in the same space, crossing paths without ceremony. She looked at me briefly, not with curiosity or caution, but with a calm indifference that caught me off guard. There was no tension in her posture, no uncertainty. She moved as though she belonged there, as though my presence was incidental. I felt invisible standing a few feet away from my own life. After that, the shift in family dynamics became harder to dismiss. Questions that would have once been directed to me were now addressed to her. Plans were discussed with her input already folded in. I noticed how often she seemed to know things before I did. Dates, arrangements, decisions that affected all of us. He never corrected it. Not once. When I finally expressed how uncomfortable it made me feel, I chose my words carefully. I didn't accuse, I didn't demand, I simply said I felt pushed aside. He listened with an expression that suggested patience, then responded in the same calm tone he'd begun using more frequently. He told me I was sensitive, that I was letting insecurity color my perception, that there was nothing happening that I needed to be concerned about. The problem with being told you're imagining things is that you start questioning your own instincts. I replayed moments in my head, wondering if I had misunderstood them. I tried to see things the way he described, through the lens of logic and practicality. I wanted to be fair. I wanted to be reasonable. His family reinforced that narrative without raising their voices. Advice came disguised as concern. A quiet word here, a gentle suggestion there. I was encouraged to be flexible, to adapt, to trust the process. The underlying message was always the same, even if no one said it outright. This would be easier if I didn't resist. One afternoon, a family member pulled me aside. The conversation was framed as guidance, as someone older sharing wisdom. They spoke about how relationships evolve, how sometimes roles change, how it's important to know when to step back for the greater good. Their voice was warm, but the meaning underneath was unmistakable. It wasn't comfort. It was a warning. I noticed how comfortable he and the woman were together in ways that no longer existed between us. They spoke easily, laughed without effort, shared looks that carried understanding instead of explanation. There was no need for secrecy anymore because, in their minds, the outcome was already decided. I began to understand something that chilled me more than anger ever could. She wasn't being added to our lives. She was being positioned to take my place. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment where the truth exploded into the open. It revealed itself quietly, through consistency, through patterns that refused to break no matter how much I rationalized them, through the realization that my discomfort wasn't an obstacle to be addressed, but an inconvenience to be managed. I stopped bringing it up after that, not because it hurt less, but because I could see how quickly concern turned into dismissal, how easily my feelings were reframed as obstacles. Every time I stayed quiet, their confidence grew. Every time I swallowed my words, her presence expanded. It was during a gathering, one I barely remember for any reason other than the way it made me feel, that clarity finally settled in. She spoke openly about future plans, using language that assumed continuity, permanence, as if the space I occupied was already vacant. No one corrected her. No one looked at me. I felt something harden inside my chest. Not grief, not jealousy, recognition. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't misunderstanding. It wasn't me failing to adapt fast enough. It was intentional, methodical, and already well underway. I left that day knowing something had shifted beyond repair. The illusion I had clung to, that patience and understanding would restore balance, finally collapsed. I understood then that waiting would not protect me. Silence would not save me. They had already decided who belonged. And it wasn't me. By the time I realized money was moving without me, the decisions had already been made. He told me one evening, casually, as if mentioning the weather. Something had been adjusted, something streamlined. The way he said it implied relief, like he had lifted a burden from my shoulders. I remember standing there, listening, waiting for the part where he would ask what I thought. It never came. I nodded, slow and automatic, while my mind tried to catch up. I asked a question, careful not to sound accusatory. He smiled, that same practiced calm I had come to recognize, and said it was all handled. Nothing for me to worry about. He said it with confidence, as though worry itself had been the real problem all along. That night I lay awake replaying his words. All handled. The phrase echoed louder than it should have. It wasn't reassurance, it was a dismissal. The first sign was access. Accounts I had once been able to view without hesitation were suddenly unavailable. Not locked exactly, just redirected. When I asked, he explained it away with efficiency, centralization, simplification, less clutter. He said it was better this way, easier for everyone. For everyone except me. His family reinforced it without even realizing they were doing it. Comments floated my way about how fortunate I was not to have to deal with complicated matters. How lucky I was to have someone so capable taking care of things. The words were coded in concern, but underneath them was something else entirely. A quiet assumption that I didn't need to be involved anymore. I started to notice how often decisions were framed as protections rather than exclusions. You shouldn't have to worry about that. This will keep things stable. It's better if one person oversees it. Each explanation chipped away at something I couldn't quite name yet. Then I learned she was involved. Not directly, not openly. I heard it in fragments, pieces of conversation that slipped past before anyone realized I was listening. Her input, her understanding, her practicality. He spoke about her ideas with trust, even admiration. When I asked why her perspective mattered so much, he hesitated, then said she simply had a good grasp of things. Reassurance followed immediately. "You're still my wife. This doesn't change anything. You know that." But it had already changed everything. Money stopped feeling neutral after that. It no longer felt like a shared resource. It felt like leverage. When I asked for clarity, his patience thinned just enough for me to notice. He implied that my questions created tension, that my insistence on understanding details made things harder than they needed to be. I watched his family take his side without discussion. Not loudly, not aggressively, just quietly, as if the conclusion had been obvious to them for some time. I was advised to trust him, to focus on what I did best, to let the rest go. I realized then that I wasn't being spared responsibility. I was being removed from it. The moment that made my stomach drop came unexpectedly. I was looking through paperwork one afternoon, something mundane, when I noticed a document that didn't sit right. The date was unfamiliar, the wording vague in places where it shouldn't have been. There was a clause that assumed agreement I never remembered giving. I read it twice, then a third time. My name was there, but my consent wasn't. I didn't confront him right away. I folded the paper carefully and put it back where I found it. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight, like something heavy had settled there permanently. That document wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was written with the expectation that I wouldn't object, or that if I did, it wouldn't matter. That was when the emotional weight of what was happening finally caught up with me. It wasn't just about finances, it was about identity, about being treated as temporary in my own life. Decisions about my future were being made with the quiet confidence of people who no longer saw me as part of the equation. I began to feel smaller in ways that had nothing to do with money, less informed, less relevant, less necessary. Conversations shifted when I entered rooms. Plans were referenced as if I already knew them, even when I didn't. Every time I asked for clarification, I felt like I was revealing something they wished I'd stopped noticing. Trust eroded in silence. I stopped asking questions for a while, not because I had answers, but because I needed to understand the shape of what I was facing. I watched, I listened. I noticed how often my absence was assumed, how naturally my exclusion fit into their version of normal. The most painful realization wasn't that they were taking things from me. It was that they believed they had the right to. That belief showed itself everywhere. In the way he spoke to me when money came up, in the way his family nodded along, in the way she was consulted openly while I was reassured privately. One evening, after another conversation that left me feeling invisible, I sat alone and tried to pinpoint when exactly things had crossed a line. It wasn't one moment. It was a series of quiet shifts, each small enough to excuse on its own, devastating when viewed together. I understood then that what was happening wasn't confusion or miscommunication. It was deliberate. A restructuring that placed me outside the center of my own marriage. The financial changes weren't the cause. They were the confirmation. By the end of that week, something inside me had hardened. Not into anger, but into clarity. I stopped hoping that transparency would be offered. I stopped believing that patience would earn me fairness. The money was moving without me because they had already decided I didn't need to be there. And for the first time, I understood that her presence and my exclusion were not separate issues. They were parts of the same plan. I didn't know yet how I would respond, but I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. The moment denial finally broke wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or tears or a dramatic confession. It arrived quietly, with a thought that refused to be ignored. This wasn't unfolding by accident. It had been planned. That realization settled over me one morning as I watched the rhythm of my own home continue without me. Conversations happened around me, not with me. Plans were discussed openly, as if my agreement were assumed or unnecessary. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was overreacting and started asking a far more unsettling question. How long had this been organized without my knowledge? She no longer hovered at the edges of my life after that. She stepped fully into the open, not with hesitation, but with ease. It happened during a gathering that was framed as routine, something I was expected to attend and accept without question. She was there, seated comfortably among his family, included without explanation. No introductions were made. No one paused to acknowledge the shift. It was as if I were the only person in the room who hadn't received the memo. I remember standing there, feeling strangely out of place in my own space. She spoke easily, her voice confident, her presence unchallenged. People listened to her. They deferred to her. I realized then that this wasn't a reveal, it was a confirmation. She had already been woven into their plans long before I saw her sitting there. His language changed after that. Where he once reassured, he now asserted. Where explanations used to appear, there were only conclusions. He spoke about what needed to happen, about what made sense, about what was inevitable. I noticed how often he used the word best without ever saying best for whom. When I questioned him privately, he didn't deny what was happening. He reframed it. He spoke about growth, about evolution, about how relationships sometimes outgrow old dynamics. His tone was calm, measured, almost instructive, as if he were helping me understand something I was slow to grasp. I asked him when he had decided this. Not just about her, but about me. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to tell me he knew exactly what I meant. Then he said the timing wasn't important. What mattered was moving forward without unnecessary conflict. That was when I understood that remorse wasn't coming. His family stopped pretending, too. Comments that once would have been softened by concern were now delivered plainly. They spoke about compatibility and practicality, about how sometimes people no longer fit where they once did. I listened as my years of loyalty were reframed as temporary usefulness. Approval, it turned out, had always been conditional. The most painful part wasn't learning that he was involved with her. That truth, once it surfaced, felt almost secondary. What cut deeper was the way it was treated. There was no shame, no secrecy, no sense that boundaries had been crossed. Their relationship was discussed as a logistical improvement, a solution rather than a betrayal. I was expected to accept it quietly, to respond calmly, to be reasonable. When I confronted him again, this time without softness, I asked him if he had ever intended to include me in the decisions that now governed my life. He looked at me with something close to impatience and said I was holding on to a version of the past that no longer existed. He told me I needed to adjust. That word stayed with me. Adjust. It was then that the full weight of what was happening became clear. I wasn't being pushed out in a moment of chaos. I was being methodically removed. Piece by piece, role by role, plan by plan. The future they discussed didn't include space for negotiation. It included timelines, transitions, and assumptions that positioned me as an obstacle rather than a partner. She was discussed in terms of permanence. I was discussed in terms of transition. I felt grief then, sharp and sudden, but it didn't soften me the way I expected. It hardened into something else, something steadier. I realized that pleading wouldn't change their course. Explaining myself wouldn't restore my place. They had already written me out of the narrative that mattered to them. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand answers that had already been made irrelevant. I sat alone and allowed the truth to settle fully, without resistance. This was never just an affair. It was a coordinated effort to erase me. Understanding that changed everything. It stripped away the last of my hesitation, the last hope that patience might bring clarity or fairness. I saw now that my silence had been interpreted as consent, my adaptability mistaken for weakness. I made a decision then, a quiet one. I would stop reacting. I would stop explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. I would observe. I would listen. I would gather what they assumed I wasn't capable of noticing. If they believed I was finished, that belief would become my greatest advantage. By the end of that week, I had said very little, and in my silence, they grew comfortable, confident, careless. They spoke freely, unaware that the woman they thought had been removed from the equation was finally seeing it clearly. For the first time since this began, I felt something that wasn't fear or grief. I felt resolve. They had planned my removal meticulously. Now I would plan my response. I stopped speaking the day I understood that every word I offered was being used against me. Not in the dramatic sense people imagine, with shouting matches and slammed doors, but in the quiet way that drains you faster. Every explanation I gave became proof that I was emotional. Every question became evidence that I was difficult. Every attempt to clarify was reframed as resistance. So I made a decision that felt unnatural at first. I went silent. At first, they didn't notice. They were too busy enjoying the smoothness of things, the absence of pushback. When I didn't react, they assumed I had finally accepted my place. When I didn't argue, they believed I had given up. Silence to them meant surrender. To me, it meant observation. I started paying attention to the details I had once been too distracted to notice. Who closed doors before speaking, who lowered their voice when certain topics came up, who suddenly became very careful about what they said around me, and who became careless because they assumed I wasn't listening anymore. It was astonishing how freely people talked once they believed you were defeated. I noticed patterns forming, subtle but consistent. Conversations that always happened when I wasn't in the room. Documents that appeared briefly, then disappeared. Decisions referenced casually, as if their outcomes were already common knowledge. I began to understand that I hadn't been excluded because I was uninvolved. I had been excluded because I was inconvenient. What they didn't know was that I still had access to things they had forgotten about. Old emails, shared files, records I had once helped organize and that no one had bothered to revoke. Knowledge of timelines and habits that came from years of proximity. I wasn't locked out nearly as completely as they believed. They underestimated how much information lingers when people assume you're irrelevant. I also remembered who I had been before I learned to make myself smaller, before I softened my voice to keep the peace, before I questioned my instincts because someone else was more confident. I had always been methodical, careful. I noticed inconsistencies. I remembered details. Those qualities hadn't disappeared. They had just been discouraged. Reclaiming them didn't feel empowering at first. It felt dangerous. I tested my silence deliberately. I let comments pass without response. I allowed assumptions to stand unchallenged. Each time I watched their confidence grow. He became more relaxed. She became bolder. His family spoke with less caution. The more invisible I appeared, the more they revealed. There was a moment, late one evening, when I overheard a conversation that confirmed what I had suspected. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, just practical language. Timelines, expectations. The kind of discussion people have when they believe the outcome is already secured. My name came up briefly, not as a person, but as a complication that had been handled. That was when something inside me finally settled. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't poor communication. It was premeditated. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't let my breathing change. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands steady, my mind sharp. Whatever fear I had felt before gave way to focus. If this was a plan, then it had structure. And if it had structure, it could be understood. From that point on, I became intentional. I paid attention to dates, to wording, to what was said and what was carefully avoided. I stopped seeking fairness from people who benefited from my absence. Instead, I gathered clarity. What surprised me most was how invisible competence can be when people stop expecting it from you. They spoke openly in front of me. They left things where I could see them. They underestimated my ability to connect dots because they believed I no longer had the will to try. They were wrong. Each small confirmation strengthened my resolve. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't imagining things. What I was seeing fit together too neatly to be coincidence. I understood then that reacting emotionally would only warn them. Silence, on the other hand, made them careless. And so I stayed quiet. I stopped asking for explanations. I stopped requesting transparency. I let them believe their narrative had worked, that I was exhausted, resigned, ready to move on without a fight. The more they believed that, the safer I became. There was a strange calm in it, once I accepted what I was doing. I wasn't plotting revenge in the way movies portray it. I wasn't fantasizing about confrontations or clever speeches. I was preparing, patiently, methodically. The way people do when they know timing matters more than volume. One night, as I reviewed something I had found earlier that day, it hit me how far things had shifted. Just weeks ago, I had been pleading to be heard. Now I was choosing not to speak because I understood more than they realized. I thought about the courtroom then, though I hadn't stepped into it yet. About how silence carries different weight there. About how truth doesn't need to be loud when it's documented. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to control. They believed the story was already written, that my role had ended quietly, without resistance. They assumed I would disappear with minimal disruption, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they allowed me to keep. They never bothered to learn what I was capable of when left alone long enough to think. I didn't need to confront them anymore. I didn't need to convince them of my worth. I needed to let them continue underestimating me for just a little while longer. The courtroom would be the first place I spoke honestly again, and when I did, it wouldn't sound anything like surrender. The atmosphere in the house shifted before anyone said a word. I could feel it the moment I walked in, the way conversations stopped too late to pretend they hadn't been happening. There was no tension anymore, no effort to keep up appearances. The pretending was over. They had moved on to the part where they believed resistance no longer mattered. He told me there was something we needed to discuss, his voice calm, rehearsed. Not a request. An announcement. I followed him into the living room and saw them already seated there, arranged in a way that made the alignment unmistakable. Him, her, and one of his family members positioned close enough to make it clear this wasn't just personal. It was strategic. No one asked me to sit, but a space had been left, slightly apart. I took it. He spoke first, framing the conversation as necessary and overdue. He talked about realities, about changes, about how things couldn't continue the way they were. His tone was careful, almost gentle, the way people speak when they want to sound reasonable while delivering something cruel. Then his family member spoke, reinforcing his words with authority disguised as concern. They talked about stability, about what made sense, about minimizing conflict. Each sentence landed with the same implication. This was already decided. No one asked what I wanted. They spoke about me as if I weren't there, describing my reactions, my limitations, my supposed inability to adapt. They rewrote my history with casual confidence, turning years of compromise into proof that I was too emotional, too difficult, too attached to the past. I listened without interrupting. I let them finish. When she spoke, it was with ease. No hesitation, no shame. She talked about the future as if it were already hers to plan. Dates, arrangements, adjustments. Her language assumed continuity, permanence. She didn't look at me once. That was when I understood something with chilling clarity. She wasn't competing for space, she was claiming it. Then came the warning. It wasn't delivered like a threat. It didn't need to be. It was wrapped in practicality, in suggestions meant to sound helpful. If I cooperated, things could remain civil. If I made this difficult, consequences would follow. Financial complications, legal entanglements, reputational damage. The words were measured, the tone calm, but the message was unmistakable. Make this easy. I felt a familiar urge rise in my chest, the instinct to defend myself, to correct the narrative, to explain who I was and what I had contributed. I recognized that urge for what it was. A trap, so I didn't take it. I responded carefully, acknowledging their statements without agreeing to them. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said I needed time to consider what had been said. My calm unsettled them, just slightly. They had expected tears, anger, a breakdown. What they saw instead looked like defeat. They mistook my composure for surrender. The final provocation came shortly after, delivered with startling casualness. A boundary crossed without hesitation. A space claimed that had once been mine. A decision enacted without discussion. It was done in front of me, as if daring me to object. I didn't. I stood, thanked them for their honesty, and excused myself. As I walked away, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not sadness, not rage, certainty. There was no middle ground left, no compromise to be negotiated, no version of this where patience restored balance. They had crossed from manipulation into coercion, from exclusion into erasure. I left the house that night without looking back. The air outside felt colder, sharper, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, my hands steady on the wheel, my thoughts unusually clear. This wasn't the end of my marriage. That had already happened quietly, long before this confrontation. This was the end of my hesitation. I understood now that staying silent inside that house would only serve their version of events. Silence had been useful for observation, but it would not protect me from what came next. The next conversation would not happen on their terms, in their territory, with their rules. It would happen somewhere neutral, somewhere facts mattered more than confidence, somewhere truth didn't need permission to be heard. As I drove away, I replayed the evening in my mind, not with disbelief but with focus. Every word, every assumption, every miscalculation they had made about me. They believed they had cornered me, that I would choose the path of least resistance to preserve some shred of comfort. They had underestimated how dangerous clarity can be. By the time I reached my destination, the decision had fully formed. I would not argue in living rooms or negotiate my worth with people invested in my removal. I would not defend myself in spaces designed to silence me. The next time we spoke, it would be in a courtroom. And there, silence would no longer belong to them. The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound, and for the first time in months, I was alone without feeling watched. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the weight of what had just happened settle. There was no panic, no urge to turn back, just a clear understanding that whatever life I had been trying to preserve inside that house no longer existed. They assumed I had nowhere else to go. That assumption would become their mistake. The first call I made wasn't emotional, it was deliberate. I reached out to someone who had never been part of his family's orbit, someone who knew me before I learned how to soften myself to survive. When I explained what was happening, I stuck to facts, no embellishment, no justification. I didn't need sympathy, I needed clarity. What surprised me was how quickly she recognized the pattern. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question my memory. She didn't suggest I was misreading intentions. When I finished, there was a brief pause. Then she said something that grounded me completely. This isn't confusion. This is strategy. Being believed felt almost disorienting. We talked through what was at stake, piece by piece. Not just finances, but autonomy. Not just reputation, but future leverage. For the first time, I saw how close I had come to losing far more than I realized. Delay, she explained, would only work against me. The longer I stayed quiet without action, the more their version of events would solidify. That night, I didn't sleep much, but I didn't spiral either. My mind moved methodically, organizing information, recalling dates, replaying conversations with a new lens. Things that had felt disjointed before began to align. The structure of their plan became clearer the more I examined it without emotion. The next few days required discipline. I returned to shared spaces and conversations with the same calm I had practiced before, but now it was anchored by purpose. I didn't reveal what I knew. I didn't change my demeanor. I behaved exactly as they expected me to, quiet, compliant, reasonable. They relaxed almost immediately. He became more casual, more confident. She grew bolder, speaking openly about timelines and outcomes as if they were already settled. His family spoke freely around me, assuming I had accepted the inevitable. Comfort breeds carelessness, and they had grown very comfortable. I listened. I noted how often dates were mentioned without specificity, how assumptions replaced confirmations. I paid attention to the language they used when discussing assets, obligations, transitions. Words matter, especially when people believe no one is documenting them. Every evening I wrote things down, not emotionally, factually. What was said, who said it, when. I didn't need every detail to be explosive. I needed consistency. Patterns speak louder than isolated incidents. There were moments when fear tried to creep back in, usually late at night, when exhaustion loosened my focus. What if this didn't work? What if they really had thought of everything? Each time I reminded myself of one simple truth. They believed I was finished. People rarely protect against threats they no longer acknowledge. The most telling moment came unexpectedly. I overheard a conversation that was meant to be private, the kind people have when they believe the outcome is secure. They spoke about next steps, about how quickly things would move once everything was finalized. My name was mentioned briefly, then dismissed with a confidence that chilled me. Handled. That single word confirmed everything. I didn't react. I didn't confront them. I waited until the conversation ended, until laughter replaced planning, until the house settled back into its routine. Then I went to my room and added another note to my growing list. By the end of that week, I felt different. Not stronger in the dramatic sense, but steadier. Fear had been replaced by focus. Anger had sharpened into resolve. I wasn't imagining a confrontation anymore. I was preparing for a procedure. I met again with my ally, laying out what I had gathered. She didn't smile. She didn't dramatize. She nodded slowly, then told me what I already sensed. This would come down to timing and restraint. Say nothing. Do nothing that alerts them. Let them continue believing their narrative. The courtroom, she explained, is not a place for emotional explanations. It's a place for documented truth. The person who speaks less often listens more carefully. That suited me just fine. As the hearing approached, I felt an unexpected calm settle in. I wasn't hopeful. Hope implies uncertainty. I was prepared. Preparation carries its own quiet confidence. They continued underestimating me right up until the end. He spoke about the hearing as a formality. She joked about how quickly it would be over. His family discussed plans as if the outcome were guaranteed. I let them. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes carefully, choosing simplicity over statement. I didn't need to look powerful. I needed to look credible. I slept better than I had in weeks. On the morning we drove separately to the courthouse, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even angry. I felt detached, as if I had already stepped beyond the version of myself they were trying to control. As I walked toward the building, the weight of what I carried wasn't fear or resentment. It was truth. And truth, when timed correctly, has a way of speaking for itself. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, a neutral place designed to make every story feel small and procedural. I arrived early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. Preparation had become my anchor. My hands were steady as I passed through security. No racing thoughts, no last-minute doubts. I had already done the hard part long before this morning. All that remained was timing. I took my seat quietly, setting my bag at my feet, folding my hands in my lap. Across the room, he entered with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already written. His posture was relaxed, shoulders loose, his expression almost bored. She walked beside him, close enough that their arms brushed, her smile polished and easy. They looked like people attending an obligation they expected to end quickly. They didn't look at me at first. When they did, it was brief, a glance, a flicker of recognition, then dismissal. He leaned toward her, whispering something I couldn't hear, and she smiled wider, nodding as if confirming a private joke. Whatever he said reassured her. Whatever she believed reassured him. Behind them, members of his family settled into their seats, composed and expectant. Their presence wasn't accidental. It was meant to communicate unity, strength, inevitability. They sat like spectators, confident in the ending. I sat alone. That isolation would have terrified me months ago. Now it clarified everything. When the judge entered, the room rose and fell in practiced unison. Papers were arranged, chairs adjusted. The hearing began the way so many do, with formal language and careful pacing. His attorney spoke first, smooth and assured, framing the situation with confidence that bordered on casual dismissal. I listened without reacting as my role was summarized for the room. Peripheral, emotional, complicated. A presence, but not a contributor. The narrative was clean, efficient, and incomplete in exactly the ways they needed it to be. He avoided looking at me while his attorney spoke. She didn't. She watched me closely, as if gauging whether I would finally break, whether this public setting would succeed where private pressure had failed. I didn't give her anything. The attorney finished, clearly satisfied. The silence that followed felt like confirmation to them. I could sense it in the way he shifted back in his chair, in the way his family relaxed. Confidence filled the room like a settled verdict. My silence worked exactly the way they expected it to. He leaned toward her again, close enough that I could see his lips move this time. We won. The words were soundless to me, but unmistakable. She laughed softly, barely audible, her satisfaction contained but complete. The sound carried just enough to sting, just enough to humiliate. I kept my eyes forward. The judge reached for the file. It was a simple motion, unremarkable, but the room changed instantly. The judge didn't speak. She didn't react. She opened the file and began to read, her attention fully absorbed by the pages in front of her. The quiet stretched longer than expected. At first, no one noticed. His attorney reviewed notes. His family whispered softly, then stopped when the silence grew heavier. She crossed her legs, then uncrossed them. He adjusted his tie. The judge kept reading. I watched the room instead of the file, watched confidence shift into uncertainty in small, almost imperceptible ways. A straightened spine, a breath held too long, a glance toward the bench that lingered. They had expected speed, efficiency, a procedural conclusion. Instead, they were given time. The judge paused, turned a page, and continued reading. Something tightened in my chest, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't confusion. This was attention, the kind of attention that changes outcomes. He noticed it then. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his foot stilled against the floor. She leaned back slightly, her smile fading at the edges. His family fell silent behind them, eyes fixed on the bench now, no longer on me. The judge's expression didn't change. She read carefully, deliberately, as if every word mattered. The courtroom seemed to shrink around that file, everything else receding into irrelevance. I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. This was why preparation mattered. This was why silence had been necessary, not because I lacked a voice, but because I knew when it would be strongest. The judge stopped reading. For a moment, she simply sat there, the file open in front of her, her hand resting on the page. The pause wasn't theatrical. It was thoughtful, heavy in a way that made the air feel thick. He shifted in his seat, a subtle movement that betrayed his discomfort. She glanced at him, her brows knitting just slightly, uncertainty breaking through her composure for the first time. The judge lifted her eyes. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at his attorney. Her gaze moved across the room and settled on me. I met her eyes calmly, evenly, without flinching. In that moment, I understood something that had taken me months to learn. Power doesn't announce itself loudly. It reveals itself when everything else goes quiet. The judge closed the file. The sound was soft, final, unmistakable. He inhaled, preparing for the formalities he believed were coming. His attorney straightened, ready to respond. She leaned forward slightly, bracing herself for confirmation. The judge drew a breath. And before she said a single word, I knew they were wrong. The silence broke with a single sentence. The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward or soften her tone. She simply spoke, clearly and evenly, as if stating a fact that had always been true. The words themselves were procedural, almost ordinary, but the meaning behind them landed like a dropped weight. She ordered an immediate suspension of all contested actions until further review. That was it. One sentence. No commentary. No explanation yet. The effect was immediate. He blinked, once, then again, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. His attorney stiffened beside him, pen hovering uselessly above his notes. The woman's smile froze on her face, then slowly disappeared, replaced by something closer to confusion than fear. Behind them, his family leaned forward, whispering urgently, their earlier confidence evaporating in real time. I didn't move. The judge continued, clarifying the implications with the same measured calm. Everything they believed was settled was no longer settled. Every assumption they had made about speed, inevitability, and control was suddenly subject to scrutiny. The ground they thought they were standing on shifted beneath them, and they had no footing to adjust. His attorney stood quickly, objecting, his voice sharp with practiced authority. He spoke fast, piling words on top of one another, trying to regain momentum. The judge listened without interruption, her expression unchanged. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head once. Denied. That single word carried more weight than all his arguments combined. He tried to speak then, unable to stop himself. It wasn't a formal objection. It was frustration leaking through restraint. The judge cut him off before he could finish, reminding him that this was not the moment for explanation, and certainly not for persuasion. Authority filled the room, cold and absolute. The woman shifted in her seat, her posture no longer relaxed. She glanced toward him, then toward his family, as if searching for reassurance that no longer existed. No one met her eyes. She had become something she wasn't prepared to be. Irrelevant. The judge continued outlining next steps, her language precise, unhurried. Reviews would be conducted. Documentation examined, timelines verified. The certainty they had carried into the courtroom dissolved with every sentence she added. For the first time since this began, I felt something lift from my chest. Not relief exactly. Recognition. This was what fairness sounded like when it wasn't trying to please anyone. The judge finally turned her attention to me. She addressed me formally, using my name, acknowledging my position without embellishment or sympathy. Her tone was neutral, but there was something else there too. Respect. Not earned through emotion, but through preparation. I answered simply, clearly, no excess words, no unnecessary explanation. I had learned the value of restraint. She nodded once, satisfied, and moved on. Around me, the room felt altered, like a place after a storm has passed through. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, papers shuffling as if rearranged documents might restore what had been lost. His family sat rigid, their faces tight with concern and calculation. The woman stared straight ahead now, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. No one laughed. The judge brought the session to a close with instructions for what would follow. Deadlines were set, conditions imposed, boundaries established. Each directive reinforced the same truth. The story they had prepared to tell no longer mattered. When the gavel finally struck, the sound echoed through the room with a finality that made my hands tremble just slightly. Court was adjourned. People stood. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, hurried and tense. I gathered my things calmly, unhurried, feeling none of the urgency that rippled through the other side of the room. He didn't look at me as I passed. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. The version of me he had dismissed no longer existed in the way he needed her to. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, cooler. I paused just beyond the doors, letting the noise fade behind me. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't bracing myself for what might happen next. I watched them emerge moments later. His family clustered tightly around him, voices low and urgent. The woman stood slightly apart now, uncertain where she belonged in the sudden shift. She caught my eye briefly, then looked away. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over, not entirely. There would be consequences still unfolding, truths still examined, reckonings yet to come. But the outcome they had counted on was gone. They had walked into that courtroom believing they had already won. They walked out knowing they had lost control. As I stepped away, the weight of the past months finally began to loosen its grip. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't begged. I hadn't needed to convince anyone of my worth. I had let the truth speak. And when it did, it needed only one sentence. The hallway outside the courtroom emptied faster than I expected, voices dissolving into the distance until only the hum of the building remained. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting against the cool wall, breathing in a way I hadn't allowed myself to breathe in months. Victory didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with stillness. I watched them from a distance as they regrouped near the exit. He was surrounded immediately, his family closing ranks around him, their heads bent together in urgent whispers. The confidence they had carried into the courtroom was gone, replaced by calculation and unease. Plans were being rewritten on the fly. Futures reimagined without the certainty they'd relied on for so long. She stood a few steps away from them. No one reached for her, no one reassured her. She looked suddenly unsure of where she belonged, her posture stiff, her expression strained. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed aware that proximity to power is not the same as protection. I didn't feel satisfaction watching them unravel. What I felt was distance, emotional, final distance. Their chaos no longer belonged to me. I walked outside alone. The air felt sharper, cleaner, like rain after a long drought. I stood on the courthouse steps and let the moment settle, not rushing it, not trying to define it too quickly. This wasn't happiness. It wasn't closure in the way people imagine it, tied up neatly with a bow. It was balance. I thought about what I had lost along the way. A marriage I believed in. Years of trust. The version of myself that assumed fairness would be automatic if I worked hard enough to deserve it. Those losses were real, and I didn't pretend otherwise. Healing doesn't come from denying the damage. But I also thought about what they hadn't managed to take. They hadn't taken my ability to think clearly under pressure. They hadn't taken my patience or my attention to detail or my instinct to notice when something doesn't add up. Most importantly, they hadn't taken my voice. They had only convinced themselves that I wouldn't use it. That distinction changed everything. The judge's sentence replayed in my mind, not word for word, but in meaning. One sentence had been enough to stop momentum, to force scrutiny, to remind everyone in that room that confidence does not equal correctness. Authority doesn't need to shout when the truth is well documented. For months, I had been told to adjust, to be flexible, to make things easier for everyone else. Standing there now, I realized how often those words are used to keep people quiet when they start asking the right questions. I didn't need revenge. I needed restoration. The process wasn't over, not technically. There would be reviews, consequences, long-term outcomes still unfolding. But the most important shift had already happened. I was no longer reacting to decisions made about me. I was participating in decisions made with facts. That mattered more than any apology I would never receive. As I walked to my car, I thought about how many people live in that same quiet space I had occupied for so long. The space where you know something is wrong but are told you're imagining it. Where staying calm is mistaken for consent. Where silence is interpreted as weakness instead of strategy. If you're listening to this and any part of it feels familiar, I want you to know something. You are not invisible because you are quiet. You are not powerless because you choose your moments carefully. And you are not wrong for wanting fairness instead of drama. Sometimes the strongest response is patience. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait until the right room, the right moment, and the right authority are present to hear the truth. I didn't win because I outshouted anyone. I won because I prepared, I paid attention, and I trusted myself when it mattered most. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or quietly pushed aside, I'd love to hear your story. You're not alone in this, even when it feels that way. Share your thoughts in the comments. This channel exists for conversations like these, for stories about justice, dignity, and finding your footing again after someone tried to erase it. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like it and subscribe. There are more real stories here, more moments where the tables turn not because someone screams louder, but because the truth finally gets the space it deserves. Sometimes everything changes not with a fight, but with one sentence spoken at exactly the right time. And sometimes staying quiet is how you make sure you're heard.